The dorm room was quiet, save for the soft hum of a nearby fan and the occasional rustle of papers. It was a small space, cramped with 2 desks pushed against opposite walls, an unmade bed tucked into the corner, and shelves filled with textbooks, snacks, and half-empty coffee mugs. For years, this room had been a sanctuary, a place where laughter echoed off the walls and late-night conversations blurred into early mornings. It was the kind of space where secrets were shared and dreams were voiced without hesitation. This was home, not just for the protagonist, but for his best friend, Ethan. Ethan had been there since the very first day of freshman year. They'd been inseparable from the start, united by their shared sense of humor and a deep-rooted understanding of each other. They were more than friends, they were brothers. Ethan had always been the type to crack jokes to lift the mood, his carefree nature balancing out the more serious, introspective tendencies of the protagonist. Their friendship felt like an unbreakable bond, one that could withstand anything, or so the protagonist believed. There was a familiarity in the way they navigated the room, knowing each other's rhythms like second nature. Ethan, with his unruly hair and ever-present grin, always had a way of making light of even the toughest days. The protagonist, quieter and more reserved, often found solace in Ethan's presence, in the way their conversations could flow seamlessly from deep philosophical musings to absurd jokes that made them both laugh until their stomachs hurt. But lately, things had started to shift, though neither of them fully acknowledged it. The protagonist felt a subtle tension, an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't about Ethan, it was about someone else. Someone who had appeared in their lives recently, changing everything. The newcomer was Sarah, a freshman who had quickly made her mark in the dorm. She was charismatic, with a quick wit and an infectious laugh that had somehow drawn the protagonist in. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. Every shared glance, every lingering touch, fueled a growing connection that the protagonist couldn't ignore. Yet he wasn't ready to confront it, not yet. The attraction felt dangerous, as if it might unravel everything he had with Ethan. After all, how could he betray his best friend, the one person who had always been there for him? Still, the pull of Sarah was undeniable. The protagonist would find excuses to be around her, talking late into the night or walking around campus in shared silence. Ethan, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the budding tension. He was oblivious, caught up in his own world, never noticing the small but significant changes in the dynamic between the three of them. But the protagonist knew he was treading on thin ice. For now, everything seemed normal, but beneath the surface, the seeds of conflict had already been planted. Ethan was the best friend, the brother, the person the protagonist trusted most. Yet, as the days passed, the connection with Sarah became harder to ignore, and the more the protagonist tried to push it aside, the more he realized that the lie he was living could not last forever. The stage was set, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. The initial spark between the protagonist and Sarah had been nothing more than a fleeting moment, a shared glance during a late-night study session, a laugh that echoed through the empty halls of the dorm. But as days passed, that spark grew into something deeper, something unspoken but undeniably real. The protagonist tried to ignore it, convinced that it was nothing more than a passing attraction. But it wasn't. Every conversation with Sarah felt like a small piece of a puzzle coming together, and soon, it was impossible to pretend it didn't matter. They began spending more time together. Conversations that started casually would often stretch into hours, discussing everything from their favorite music to their hopes for the future. The protagonist found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. She was different from anyone he'd ever met. Her quick wit, her vulnerability masked behind a confident smile, and the way she made him feel seen in a way that no one else had. It wasn't long before those late-night study sessions turned into secret meetings, hidden away from Ethan's watchful eyes. The protagonist never intended for it to happen. He never meant to betray his best friend, but every time he was with Sarah, it felt right. There was an intensity to their connection that was undeniable. Their first kiss had been unplanned, a spontaneous moment that had felt as inevitable as the rising sun. The protagonist had never experienced anything like it. Electric, thrilling, and terrifying all at once. But with every stolen moment, the guilt grew heavier. The protagonist would return to their shared dorm room, knowing that Ethan was just on the other side of the wall, unaware of the secret blooming between him and Sarah. The tension between the protagonist and Ethan had begun to shift, but neither of them said anything. Ethan was still his best friend, still the person he confided in, but now there was a wall, a subtle distance that neither could quite explain. The protagonist tried to push the feeling aside, convincing himself that everything would work itself out, that the secret wouldn't matter. One evening, after a particularly long and intimate conversation with Sarah, the protagonist stood in the hallway of the dorm, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. He hadn't planned on this. He hadn't planned on falling for Sarah, and certainly hadn't planned on keeping it hidden from Ethan. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine telling him. What if Ethan didn't understand? What if this destroyed everything? As the protagonist stood there, lost in thought, Ethan appeared from the stairwell, carrying a bag of snacks and his usual carefree smile. "You're out here looking like you've seen a ghost," Ethan said, his voice light, unaware of the storm raging inside the protagonist. It took everything in him to smile back. "Just thinking," he said, trying to shake off the anxiety that had settled in his chest. But deep down, the protagonist knew something had changed. The deeper he fell for Sarah, the more distant he felt from Ethan. And despite all his attempts to justify it, he knew he was walking a dangerous line, one that could shatter the most important bond in his life. It was a late Friday evening when the storm finally hit. The night had fallen quietly, with the usual hum of campus life fading as the clock ticked past midnight. The protagonist was sitting at his desk, staring at his laptop screen, but his thoughts were elsewhere on Sarah. They had spent the evening together again, sharing their usual secret moments, but this time, the weight of it all felt heavier. He knew it couldn't last forever. Something had to give. He closed his laptop and ran a hand through his hair, the guilt gnawing at him like an invisible weight. He had hoped the feeling of betrayal would fade with time, but it never did. The secret between him, Sarah, and Ethan felt like an insurmountable wall, growing higher with each passing day. The fear of discovery had begun to settle in, leaving him restless. Ethan had been distant lately, though the protagonist couldn't bring himself to explain why. But what if Ethan knew? What if he suspected? Just as the protagonist stood up to leave, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, Ethan pushed the door open, a familiar grin plastered across his face. "Hey, man," Ethan said, stepping in with a bag of chips in his hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Got something on your mind?" The protagonist quickly forced a smile, trying to mask the unease in his chest. "Nah, just tired," he said, his voice strained. He turned his back to Ethan and pretended to rummage through his desk, hoping the tension would ease. Ethan didn't seem convinced. "I was just down the hall," he said casually, "and saw you with Sarah earlier. Everything all right?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. The protagonist froze, his heart racing. He turned slowly, meeting Ethan's gaze. There was no malice in his voice, just a simple curiosity. But that simple question, "Saw you with Sarah earlier," was enough to send the protagonist's mind into a tailspin. He had always known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier to face. He couldn't lie to Ethan, not now. But at the same time, the weight of the truth felt unbearable. Ethan, the words faltered in his throat. His mind raced for an explanation, but there was no way to explain away what had been happening. No way to deny the truth. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What's going on? You've been acting weird lately, and I can tell something's up. He set the chips down on the desk and took a step closer, his eyes searching the protagonist's face. You know you can tell me anything, right? The protagonist could see the concern in Ethan's eyes, the sincerity of his words, and for a moment, he almost wished he could come clean. But what would it cost? His best friend, his brother, gone. Felt like a knife in his gut. Before he could respond, the door to the room swung open again, but this time it was Sarah. She stood there, wide-eyed, as if she had walked in at the worst possible moment. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately, the tension so thick it could have been sliced with a knife. Ethan's gaze darted between Sarah and the protagonist, a frown forming on his face. What's going on here? Ethan asked, his voice lower now, tinged with suspicion. The protagonist's world seemed to slow. The truth was about to come tumbling out, and there was no way to stop it. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Sarah's shallow breaths and the heavy weight of the moment. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes flicking between the protagonist and Sarah, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. The realization hit him like a freight train. His best friend, the one person he trusted more than anyone, had been hiding something. Worse, it involved Sarah, someone he'd always considered a friend. Ethan, the protagonist's voice cracked, but he couldn't continue. There were no words that could explain what had been happening. How could he? He had betrayed Ethan's trust, crossed a line that had once felt impenetrable. There was no easy way out now. Ethan's face had shifted from confusion to anger, and the intensity of it was almost palpable. So this is what's been going on? His tone was sharp, his voice tinged with hurt. All this time, you've been seeing Sarah behind my back? The protagonist opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Every apology felt hollow, inadequate. What could he say to make this right? Nothing. He had broken something that couldn't be fixed with just a few words. Sarah, standing by the door, looked between the two of them, her face pale, regret clouding her expression. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt more painful than she had imagined. Ethan, I'm sorry, she said quietly, her voice trembling. We didn't mean for this to happen. It just did. Ethan's eyes snapped to Sarah, his frown deepening. So you knew? He asked, his voice low. You knew and still went behind my back? I didn't know it would hurt you like this, Sarah whispered, her gaze shifting to the floor. I never wanted to cause this. I never meant for things to get so complicated. The weight of the words hung in the air, each one cutting deeper than the last. The protagonist stood motionless, feeling the suffocating guilt wrap around him like a noose. He could see the hurt in Ethan's eyes, the betrayal that was so clear it made his chest ache. Ethan's anger was slowly replaced by a deep, painful silence. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to say, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I thought we were brothers. I thought you were the one person I could trust. The words stung. The protagonist felt like a failure, like everything he had once valued was slipping through his fingers. Ethan, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted this. But the damage was done. The trust between them had been shattered, and no apology could undo the pain. Ethan's eyes were filled with conflict, torn between the loyalty he had once felt for his best friend and the deep betrayal that now consumed him. You don't get it? Ethan said, his voice quiet, almost resigned. It's not just about you and Sarah. It's about us, about what we had. And you ruined that. For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, the tension thick in the room. The protagonist didn't know what else to say. He wanted to fix it, but he knew that wasn't possible. Not yet, at least. I need some space, Ethan finally said, his voice shaky. He turned on his heel and left the room, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the protagonist's heart. The protagonist stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of his actions settle deep into his bones. He had lost something precious, something irreplaceable. But as the minutes passed, a realization began to form in his mind. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for healing. Sarah stepped forward, her voice soft. "What now?" she asked, her eyes filled with sorrow. The protagonist looked at the door where Ethan had just exited, his mind torn between the two people who now stood in his life, both marked by pain. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I'll figure it out. I have to."